Hello, Power Banking family. How is it going? So I want to give some shout outs to you all because I appreciate the love that you show the podcast by leaving reviews on Apple. So first of all, I know that it is a little bit challenging for people to figure out how to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, which makes it that much more special to me that y'all endure that little hectic part of the system to share your feedback. I want to call out a couple of people who have given reviews. So SX Bond says, very helpful and stimulating. Keep doing what you're doing. CMU79 says, awesome resource. In life, you get what you negotiate, not what you deserve. The Power Banking Podcast is a must listen for all women leaders. And then from my friend in Hawaii, hashtag leading from the front. Excellent podcast, Jacqueline Twillie. I am inspired by your topics and your seriousness in addressing them. As a male who supports equality for all in the workplace, you give a voice to women who are not able to speak up for themselves. Phenomenal woman of our times. Wow, y'all, I am so honored. So honored for all of that. Sean, thank you for the feedback. To my other friends who have left reviews, thank you so much. I love getting this feedback. Oftentimes when I'm just talking into the microphone, it is hard to know which content really resonates with you all. So this keeps me going. It keeps me energized, and I greatly appreciate it. Well, today I'm giving you, my podcast listeners, a masterclass for free on effective negotiation strategy. So I am recording this exclusively for you all. I'm not pulling this from any other source. So the way that you get the content today, it's designed so that you're in your earbuds, but I do hope that you'll be able to take some notes from this as well. And of course, in a few days, you will be able to download the show notes for this that will give you the highlights. So in today's masterclass, we're going to talk about effective negotiation strategy. This podcast episode is going to last longer than usual because I am going in depth. We're going to cover 6 points. Preparing a negotiation strategy, avoiding the common negotiation mistakes. We're going to talk about understanding the role of influence and persuasion in negotiating. Then we'll hop into understanding some basic bargaining techniques, and we'll wrap up with resolving conflict with negotiation strategy. So, negotiation at its core, it's a discussion aimed at reaching an agreement, okay? A discussion aimed at reaching an agreement. And so, the first part that we're going to talk about today, that's setting up your negotiation strategy. You may be familiar with this if you listen to the podcast, but we're going to go through the 5-part framework that I created, and it's a LATTE. L stands for look, A, anticipate, T, think, the second T, talk, and then our final step in the 5-point process is E, evaluate. So when you're going into a negotiation, it's so important for you to start with looking at the details. So when you look at the details, this means that you're going to be extremely thorough because in business as well as in life, information is power. The more you know, the better informed decisions you'll be able to make. So look at the necessary details related to your negotiation. Now, this is going to vary from situation to situation. So I want you to think about the last time you had a conversation with someone where you had to resolve a conflict. Negotiation, at its core, it's problem solving. And one of my favorite antidotes is negotiation is a conversation. It's not a battle. So thinking about the last time you had a conversation where you resolved a conflict, what information would have been helpful for you to know to reach a mutually beneficial decision upfront? What information would have been helpful to you upfront to resolve the situation? Okay? So the reason why I'm proposing that question to you is this. oftentimes we'll walk away from a situation and we'll say, I should have handled this way, or I should have done this. I should have said that. And we think about those things in hindsight. But by using this LATTE method, starting out of the gate, thinking about all of those details, we're able to fully put together a strategy. We're able to think through the conversation as a whole and better be able to make a decision with all of the information possible. So now that you have that answer in your head of what information you wish you would have known leading into that conversation, that's an indicator of where you should focus at next time when you go into a negotiation. So when we talk about looking at the details, those clues, such as the one that you uncovered answering that question, that's going to help you think through some things when you prepare in the future. Additionally, one of the things that you can consider is, when you're going to buy a house or purchase a car, you're going to look up what the cost is. You're going to look at the features. You're going to look at reviews. You're going to be very thorough in understanding the product that you're purchasing. Well, we can apply that same concept to when we are resolving conflict and having negotiations. So just as you would look at how many miles per hour a car gets, miles per hour, how much gas mileage you get with a car, you want to just be extremely thorough in the details of looking at your negotiation. Now that's step number 1 in the framework, which is L, look, and you're looking at the details. My rule of thumb is that you spend 1 hour per $10,000 doing preparation. Don't shout at the phone. Don't shout at the podcast. Listen, the reason why I say 1 hour per $10,000 is that information is power. The more you know, the better informed decisions you will be able to make. So take that step back so that you can fully examine all of the details that are presented to you up front. Okay, so let's take it a step further and anticipate, which is step number 2. We're going to anticipate the challenges. So a few moments ago, I asked you if you could relate to this. Walking away from a conversation or situation and saying, I should have done this, or I should have said that. Can you relate? So most of the time when I'm talking to a full class of or conducting a workshop, the heads are nodding, the eyes are lighting up. I really see people resonating with that question. And it's because we've all done that. We've gotten into a situation, hindsight being 2020, as we reflect on that conversation and we're like, now that I've had more time to think about it, I could have done these. Well, we can do that prior to a negotiation, prior to resolving a conflict. We can do this by anticipating the challenges. So think about who you're going to be speaking to, what you're going to be talking about, when the conversation will take place, where you need to have this conversation, and why you're having the conversation. Who, what, when, where, and how. So inside of anticipating the challenges, when you go through that checklist of who, what, when, where, and how, what you'll be able to do is pull out information up front, those critical elements. This is piggybacking off of looking at the details so that you can anticipate possible changes. Now, it's not enough just to look at these challenges and say, okay, these are my potential challenges. You have to take it a step further. So include it in that 1 hour of preparation per $10,000 that you're spending on that hour that you're spending to prepare. This anticipate the challenges is included in that. So think of your response or responses to these potential challenges. What I've come to learn over the course of 5 years doing this work is that it's oftentimes the things that people dread the most. I hope this doesn't come up. I'm going to cross my fingers and hopefully this uncomfortable part of the conversation we can just breeze through quickly, or maybe it won't even come up. Well, what happens is when you aren't prepared, you give up leverage. Your confidence isn't there. You begin to stutter and you're not presenting your highest self, yourself as a leader. So you have to be willing to face those things that are uncomfortable. Brené Brown, one of my favorite authors, she's a lecturer, she is a business consultant. She often says this: choose discomfort over resentment. Choose discomfort over resentment. And when I think about negotiations and I think about the challenges that people want to avoid, oftentimes they are more willing to be comfortable in the moment and not bring up the elephant in the room. But later on, they're resenting themselves for not speaking up, for not addressing that issue. And oftentimes it festers, especially when we're looking at resolving conflict. This is something that festers to a point where it gets so out of control that feelings are hurt, miscommunication has happened, and worst case scenario, money is lost. And in a business environment, we're all looking to increase the profitability of our organizations. So those things that you don't want to come up are the things that you should address up front. Now, number 3, think. Think about your walkaway point. At what point in the conversation do you either hit pause or you walk away? And sometimes you'll have to do that. You'll have to hit the pause button because things have reached a point where it's no longer productive to continue in the current time, in the current conversation. Let me give you an example. If you and another person are having a discussion, you're negotiating, you're looking to solve a problem, and emotions have been elevated, things are getting a little bit hectic, and you find yourself and the other person being very frustrated. You cannot come to an agreement. It's at that point where you know yourself, you know how you act when you get riled up, where you say, this is my walkaway point from this conversation. Now, walk away doesn't always mean this is final, done, we won't ever discuss this again. But sometimes walking away is your pause button to say, you know what, let's regroup and come back to this at another time. In other scenarios, it may be best when you recognize that things are so far gone and you can't reach an agreement that you simply have to graciously walk away. Now, in the case where you are thinking about your walk away point, think about how to do that in a manner where both you and the other party are still fully respected. That's right. How do you walk away showing the other person dignity and respect? Because ultimately, this conversation started because you both had something of mutual interest to exchange. There was an exchange of value, going back to our definition of negotiation from when we started. There was something of mutual interest that brought you both to the conversation. So, if in fact you do get to a point where you determine that you need to walk away, how do you do that in the most respectful manner so that you don't damage the relationship? So I'm going to give you a few moments here to think about the last time you were engaged in a conversation with someone and you needed to take a pause to walk away. Gotta give a special thank you to our episode sponsor, Anchor.fm. Listen, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, Anchor is the way to do it. This is why. 1, it's free to get started. They have tools that allow for you to record from your phone or your computer, and they handle the distribution on all of the places where you find podcasts. So if you want to start a podcast, this is the one-stop shop to get it all done. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm MasterClass.fm to get started. All right, so now let's talk it through. Create an outline of how you envision the conversation flowing before you get into that conversation. Negotiation is a conversation. It's not a battle, even if you're resolving conflict with someone that you have a very strong disagreement with. So think of the areas where you and the other party both have a mutual area of agreement. This should be easy to do because you're exchanging some type of value. That's what brought you to this part of the conversation. So start with your outline of talking it through. Start with that mutual area of agreement. Inside of talking it through, you want to gain as much information as possible from the other party. Stephen Covey says, seek first to understand, then be understood. In seeking to understand, then be understood, this is so important to talking it through because inside of a negotiation, you should listen more than you speak. And up to this point, I've talked to you a lot about gaining information, pulling information out. So we're going to go into detail about open-ended questions for just a few moments. Open-ended questions give you the opportunity to gain insight beyond what you were able to ascertain in the very first stages of looking at the details and anticipating the challenges. So, open-ended questions are questions that cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. So as you're creating your outline to talk it through, be very intentional given the context of the situation that you'll be negotiating and develop at least 5 to 6 open-ended questions. It does not mean that you'll have to use all of those questions inside of that negotiation, but at least you'll be prepared to have those questions up front. Talking it through this phase of our framework is all about being prepared with an outline. Also, what you should be able to do is determine if the conversation naturally drifts off topic, how will you bring it back to center? So what questions or what prompts, what activity can you engage in to bring that conversation back as you're talking it through? Okay? So this is all a part of your outline. It is totally acceptable to bring an outline to a meeting or to share an agenda, especially in the context of working with your colleagues inside of your company. It will also be appropriate if you were negotiating with someone outside of your company to give a high-level outline. So use your discretion as to how much information you would share if you were to share an agenda or an outline in advance of your conversation. Again, your goal is to reach a mutually beneficial agreement because you both came to the table out of a mutual interest. Now let's talk about the fifth part, E, which is evaluate. Evaluate the options. Not every resolution is going to be a great resolution. So, based on the information that you gained, looking at the details, anticipating the challenges, you've thought through your walkaway point, and you also have set up a clear outline for you to talk it through. Once you've gone through those 4 stages, now you're able to evaluate your options to determine, okay, this is what's available. Do I accept it or do I walk away? Do I agree with this or not? And if not, how do I graciously exit this conversation, showing the other person the respect that they deserve and out of respect for building long-term relationships? So that's our 5-part framework, LATTE. So moving right along to avoiding some common negotiation mistakes. So here are some common mistakes that I see that people make. Asking for permission to negotiate. You don't have to ask for permission to negotiate. Negotiation is a conversation. So you can just hop in and make your request. The other thing that I see is that you downplay your value to a point where it's hard to overcome what you've done defeating it. So each person brings value to the conversation. You're exchanging something of mutual value or perceived mutual value. So by downplaying the value that you add to a situation into the context of what you're negotiating for can be put you at a disadvantage. If you apologize too much, saying, oh, I'm sorry for this or I'm sorry for that, what it tends to do is it tends to put you in a weak position where the person doesn't take you as seriously as they should. So just be mindful of when you use that term, I'm sorry. One of the core things that I see people do is they second guess themselves. They're wondering, did I say the right thing? Did I do the right thing? Is this going to be right? By using the LATTE method, those 5 parts, it should increase your confidence because you've thoroughly prepared for the conversation. And when you're prepared, you can show up as your most confident self. Information is power. The more information you have, the better informed decisions that you can make. So there's no need to second guess yourself if you've done the proper research to put yourself in a position to have as much information as possible. And you've also created open-ended questions surrounding anything on the back end that you weren't able to get details for up front. So don't ignore when you get praise. That is an indicator of another way that you add value. So downplaying value and ignoring praise, those go hand in hand. So when someone compliments you, they recognize the value that you're contributing, receive that graciously instead of dismissing it. Now, the last thing that I see here is on our most common behaviors is emulating the other person's behavior. So you can understand a person's communication tone. You can match that, but it's always best to be your authentic self. Show up as the highest version of yourself. I almost started quoting Oprah. If you listen to the podcast, you know I've referenced Oprah so many times that she says, surround yourself with the people that encourage you to be the highest and grandest version of yourself. Y'all, that's one of my favorite all-time quotes. I almost said that here, but when you are emulating the other person's behavior, it does not always lend to you showing up as the highest version of yourself. So don't just emulate the other person's behavior. Emulate the behavior that allows you to show up as the highest version of yourself. So those are just some common mistakes to avoid. Now, when you think of the word influencer, who comes to mind? We're transitioning now into talking about influence and persuasion. So for the next minute, jot down as many influencers that you can. Who comes to mind when you think of this term influencer? So influence, by definition, is a dynamic factor that sways opinions and perceptions. And influence requires 3 things: trust, motivation, and power. Inside of influence, the person who is influencing others, they've gained some type of trust. They inspire some type of motivation for the person to take action. And because of those 2 things combined, that gives them power. Anyone can have influence. It's not just someone with a big social media following. It's someone that others look up to. They trust them. They can inspire them to take action. So I remember my great-grandfather, when I was growing up, he loved to watch the show called Matlock. And for my millennials, I am a millennial, but most of you don't even know this show. Matlock was someone who was a police officer. He was always doing the right thing. He was helping people out. He was solving problems. If my grandfather were to see Matlock in a commercial selling anything, or hear him on the radio selling anything, he would buy it because he trusted Matlock. And not only that, Andy Griffith was the actor's real name, but Matlock was his character. And if my grandfather were to hear his voice or see him on the commercial, he would buy anything that Matlock sold, because he was motivated to take action by someone that he knew. And because of that, Matlock had a lot of power. So think of even a person who is in a community group with you. If you trust them, or if someone trusts you, that is the first indicator that you are an influencer. So how does this tie together with negotiation and having an effective negotiation strategy? Well, there's 3 points here. So with influencing, it gives you the ability to effectively persuade and negotiate. So let's hop into the definition of persuasion. Persuasion is the ability to convince someone to take an appropriate action. Plain and simple. When you persuade someone, you're convincing them to take the appropriate action based on whatever you suggested. And with negotiation, what we see is negotiation is the ability to discuss and reach a mutually satisfactory agreement. So what we have here is influence, persuasion, and negotiation. They're all linked together. The power of persuasion is that you can get people to do what you want, and ultimately in a negotiation, you're looking to reach a mutually beneficial deal. One of the things that I like to look at are 4 frameworks in the core of persuasion. So questions, they're powerful because they get the other side talking. We've talked about the power of open-ended questions. And before you begin to influence and persuade anyone, you have to understand their frame of reference. So everything that we've talked about today up to this point, they're building blocks for this. So when you present open-ended questions, it's very important that you listen to the messaging and their positioning. Listen to what they're saying, but also the things that they leave out, the things that they're not saying. That's equally as important. Now, when you present your questions, they should be clear and concise. So oftentimes when I told you earlier that you're going to list open-ended questions in advance, you may have to edit those questions down so that you can ask them in the quickest possible manner and so that they're clear. If perhaps you're negotiating via email, it's critically important in that case that you edit your questions down so that they're clearly understood and you get straight to the point. If your question is a paragraph or more, scratch it, that's a red flag, and edit it down to 1 to 2 questions. Your question should be clear and concise. This is how you persuade someone, by communicating in a clear manner. Now, the other thing is, when you're asking questions and you're listening for the response, is focus on the needs of the other party. So why is this important? Focusing on the needs of the other party is important because you really need to understand what is important to them so that you can reach a mutually beneficial agreement. Up to our last point about negotiation. Now, finally, with that, be assertive but not aggressive. And so what this means is state your point definitively and confidently, but don't do overkill. Don't be like the salesperson in Best Buy after you've decided that this is the item that you want, where they keep trying to sell you or they keep pushing you. No one likes to be pushed that way. So present your case very confidently, be firm in what you want, but don't be overly aggressive to where that person feels like they're backed into a corner. All right. So if you all have any questions, I'm giving you so much information. I know this is a masterclass. I need you to hop into the Power Banking Facebook group and drop in your questions there, because I will do some follow-up live Q&As for any questions that you have about this podcast episode inside of that Facebook group. Okay. So moving to our next point of understanding basic bargaining techniques. Now, with our basic bargaining techniques, there are two main areas of bargaining. Bargaining is a form of negotiation, okay? So we have distributive bargaining and we have integrative bargaining. Distributive bargaining is simply you have a fixed amount of resources and we're looking at a win-lose situation. Integrative bargaining is this. It's seeking one or more settlements that create a win-win situation, okay? So our goal, based on the things that I've shared with you today, is mutually beneficial agreements, which means we're looking for win-win situations. That means, based on this definition, that we're seeking one or more settlements. So this is why I get really excited about bargaining techniques. I don't know if you hear it in my voice, but this really gets me fired up, y'all. And it's because when you look outside of the box, when you get creative, you're able to look at solutions that may not have been the first thing that come to mind, or you're looking at more than one resolution to a problem. So when we think about solving conflict and when we think about resolving conflict, there is more than one way to get to that resolution. So with that, always think outside of the box. Create more than one option to get to a resolution and our situation. We can do this, and we can do that, or we can do this, or we can do that. When you come up with this integrative bargaining technique, you're presenting more options on the table, which allows for you, it increases your chances of reaching a win-win agreement. Whereas if you were looking at a fixed amount of resources, a win-lose situation, it's more like a take it or leave it scenario. And that significantly decreases your chances of ending a conversation or a conflict with a mutually beneficial outcome. One of my very favorite quote says, you try something, it doesn't work, and maybe people even criticize you. In a fixed mindset, you say, I tried this, it's over. But in a growth mindset, you look for what you've learned. That's a quote from Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. Carol has written this amazing book on mindset, and it is a great tool. Mindset is a great tool for going into negotiation looking for a win-win resolution. So I'll read this again. You try something, it doesn't work, and maybe even people criticize you. In a fixed mindset, you say, I tried this, it's over. In a growth mindset, you look for what you've learned. All right? Similarly, Margaret Neal, a professor of negotiation at Stanford University, she says this: negotiation is about finding a solution to your counterpart's problem that makes you better off than you would have been had you not negotiated. Now remember, negotiation is a conversation. So I'm going to paraphrase Margaret Neal's quote here. Negotiation is about finding a solution to your counterpart's problem that makes you better off than you would have been had you not had the conversation. So finding a solution, it requires you to go back to our framework. L, look at the details. A, anticipate the challenges. T, think about the walkaway point. The second T, talk it through. And E, which is the fifth step of that framework, evaluate the options. Now, let's talk about conflict for a few moments here. Conflict is something that's unavoidable. It comes up in all situations, in our personal lives and in our professional lives. Here's what we know about resolving conflict. Whatever the cause of the disagreement or the dispute, by learning these next few skills, you can keep your personal and your professional relationships strong and growing. Now, especially in the professional context where you need people to advance and to get things done, you really have to be mindful and very intentional about keeping your relationship strong, especially when you run into areas of conflict. So, the first thing in resolving conflict is understanding what causes conflict. Now, conflict arises from differences, a difference of opinion, a difference of viewpoint. differences is the main reason why we have conflict. Now, it doesn't mean one person is right or one person is wrong. If I'm sitting out of my office, I overlook a park that is over an interstate in downtown Dallas. Now, for someone who is driving on the interstate, they go through a tunnel. Their view is they see a dark tunnel with a light peeking out. Or, if it's light outside, they'll see the light out. If it's dark outside, they have lights in the tunnel. For me, whether it's daylight or darkness, I see trees from my view. That is a difference of our viewpoint. It doesn't make me wrong that I see it from a different angle. It doesn't make them wrong because they see it at a different angle. We're looking at the same thing from different points. So we have to come to first an understanding of what is causing our conflict. How are we viewing this situation differently? The next thing is, in terms of resolving conflict, we must understand that when we ignore the cause of the conflict, it festers. So conflict will stay with us until we face it and we resolve it. Now, the third step, how do you respond to conflict? So think about your own behaviors. Traditionally, how do you respond when you are in a situation of conflict? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Now, the second part to understanding how you respond to conflict is why. Why do you respond that way? Now, this takes deep thought. You're probably not going to get an answer to this listening to this first version of the episode. So you might have to listen to it again or just jot this question down and think about it over the course of the next few days. But that's something that you want to think about in terms of how do you respond to conflict? Which leads us to our next step, which is how do you manage and resolve conflict? So here are 6 steps that I like to use in resolving conflict. One is agree on a mutually acceptable time and place to discuss the conflict. If you try to handle it in the heat of the moment, that's not always the best because emotions are high. So agree on a mutually acceptable time and place to discuss whatever the conflict is. The next thing is state the problem as you see it, but be specific in listing your concerns. Now, when I say specific, I mean cite examples. I don't mean go off on a tangent. Remember, be clear and concise. So that's why you want to have time to let your emotions come to a sensible level. The third step, let the other person have his or her say. The fourth part of that is listen. Listen actively and ask questions. If you have follow-up questions, try to frame those questions in an open-ended manner. Number 5, stick to one conflict or issue at a time. So if this is festered, multiple things may have been compounded. So stick to one thing at a time, resolve that, and then move on to the next. It can seem like all of these things are related and it's turned into a big snowball, but really be intentional about discussing specific issues, be clear and concise so that you can resolve anything that's festered and so that you can move on. Now, the final step, step number 6, is seek a common ground. Sometimes you will agree to disagree, but by listening to the other person, asking open-ended questions, listening to what they have to say genuinely, and you're resolving one conflict at a time, you should be able to start seeing a light at the end of the tunnel and find some common ground to resolve your conflict. So those are my 6 steps in resolving conflict. Those are the things that you can use in any type of conflict resolution. Now, there are different styles of conflict managing, such as accommodating, avoiding, compromising, collaborating, and competing. Those are very similar to the negotiation styles that I discuss in my latest book, Don't Leave Money on the Table. So in an environment where you're accommodating, you're forsaking your own needs and desires in exchange of others. I found that this isn't a style that you want to rely on too heavily, especially in a situation where things have festered, because it will just breed resentment. Now, avoiding, which is a style that leads to festering conflict anyway, because you just avoid the conflict completely. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're avoiding the conflict, where you're withdrawing, or you're saying, oh, everything's fine, when you know it isn't fine. So you definitely need to address those things. The other part, in one of the other styles that I think is very good in resolving conflict, is the collaboration. And that's where you both come together and you discuss what's going on and you collaborate on a solution. The other options that we have, there's compromising in terms of conflict resolution, where you compromise on what you want, the other person compromises, and that could be just as beneficial as the collaboration. The one that I would say avoid is the competing. Competing leads to that win-lose frame of bargaining, right? That tongue-tied there. Distributive type of bargaining or negotiation style when you're competing, because when you get to the part where you're competing, one person will win and one person will lose. So always remember that negotiation is about finding a solution to your counterpart's problems that make you and the other person better off than what you had been if you did not negotiate. And every time you get ready to go into a situation where you're going to negotiate or you're going to be resolving a conflict, I want you to think about LATTE. Because with your LATTE, it's similar to how a pilot goes through a pre-flight checklist before they take off on every flight. They're going to look at the details. This is what you do. Anticipate potential challenges. You're going to think about your walkaway point, talk it through, and evaluate your options. No matter how many times a pilot has flown, they're going to go through their pre-flight checklist to ensure the smoothest flight possible. And what you're doing when you use your LATTE to go through your negotiation checklist, you're going to ensure that you have the smoothest conversation possible. Because information is power. The more you know, the better informed decisions you can make. So I want to encourage you to think of something that Natalie Massenet says. She says, always go into a meeting or negotiations with a positive attitude. Tell yourself you're going to make this the best deal for all parties. So with that, I'm going to encourage you to do 3 things. Answer 3 questions. What are your key takeaways from today's episode? What are you going to start doing as a result of what you learned in today's episode of the podcast, this MasterClass? What will you start doing? What actions or behaviors do you need to pause? And what will you stop doing altogether? All right, y'all. So that's today's episode. I know it's a little bit longer than what we normally do, but I wanted to bring y'all a little something extra today. And I'm going to do a couple more of these for you, some extended podcasts, free masterclasses for you on effective negotiation strategy. Like I said, I know I've given you a ton of information, so hop into the Power Banking Facebook group, drop in your questions there, and I will be doing live Q&As inside of the Power Banking Facebook group. All right, so until next time, continue to emulate excellence and eliminate excuses.